All right, so welcome back everyone from our break. This is the next panel, Beyond Identity Politics, Rethinking Multicultural Outreach. So thank you for rejoining us. And I'm gonna allow each of the panelists to give a quick introduction, sort of who they are, who they work for. And this, because we always run short on time, we're gonna hop into the subject matter very, very quickly. So we're just gonna go in order from right all the way down, and then we'll kick it off. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Niamba. I was the paid media lead for Black constituency on the Harris campaign.
Hi there, my name is Tom Blake. I'm a senior vice president at Fenton, and I lead our advertising department.
Hey, CMO, vice president at Targeted Victory, where I oversee the general consulting division.
Hi, I'm Maddison Stewart. I'm the deputy political director of the Republican State Leadership Committee.
All right, very well. So let's kind of kick off this conversation. One of the things that I think we got into in the prep call that I think is something that is starting to trend when people are looking at the cluster that it is in identifying people, in particular around data, is this notion of the plurality of identities. And I think the biggest thing that I always talk to people about is we are constructed individual of multiple personalities. What shows up in the room is what the room often will tolerate. I think when you start to get into the idea of voting, and I think it was said best by one of the previous panels of discovering people who aren't as loyal as a voting bloc as they were expected to be and were more easily turned than they thought they would be. And I think part of that just comes down to is who we are is complex. So we could be one thing in one arena, but something very different in a voting arena. And we could be very different on an issue campaign, but be someone very different when we decide to vote for someone literally. So Niamba, I'm gonna start with you. How have you been approaching, you all approached identity when really identifying that people are who they say they are? Because what we found out in this past election, in particular multicultural audiences, people we thought that as a mass bloc had allegiance to one candidate, in fact, did not. And I think there was a powerful lesson in understanding that just because there seem to be some semblances in cultural classes, when it comes down to our president, like our choice of beer, we're all on a very different end of the spectrum at times.
Yeah, I kind of hate to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway, which is I'm going to borrow from the candidate and just say, I think one of the things that we can probably take from this election is everybody wants to feel like you're trying to earn their vote. And I think that was like a particularly important theme that came up in this election. Like folks were, especially Black voters, like wanted to, I think there's a long-standing kind of frustration in Black communities across the board with politics of folks are only coming to me in the last hour. I haven't heard anything from the ex-candidate in this place, and now they want my vote without having anything to sort of show for it. So I think the thing that political operatives are always talking about is how do you build that long-standing communication on the ground, building those relationships. And that just came up, I think it came to a head in this election in a way that we haven't seen it before, but that is something that folks have been responding to for a long time. And I think it's something that we're gonna have to continue to deal with, and also just understanding that the trends of who we think is gonna lean one way or another way, we actually have to like engage with the issues without taking that for granted.
So I'm gonna let Maddison sort of double tap on that, because part of your task was finding candidates to represent the other side of the aisle when the stigma is like that's almost sacrilegious. I mean, the thought of someone, let's just say, a African-American figurehead representing the Republican side is not as widely acceptable, but yet there was traction there. It exists. I think it's probably always existed. Communities just want to acknowledge it. We say that when you talk about Latinos, you can't make the same assumptions. Puerto Ricans and Dominicans very different than Venezuelans and Colombians. What was that journey like in the discovery of finding candidates, women or ethnic minorities, to represent the other side of the aisle when the retail media version of reality in the US is as if that doesn't even exist?
Sure, yeah, and I think that you're right to say that I think there's a perception that it doesn't exist, but it has for a long time, and even more so in the last decade than I think ever before. I know than ever before. At RSLC, we have what's called the Right Leaders Network, and that's a program we run to identify, train, recruit, and support minority and women and veteran candidates seeking state office at the state house, state senate level, and also statewide elected officials lower than governor on your ballot. And that is all driven by grassroots programs in the state. So we're working with our partners to find, business-minded young women who are interested in politics. Where are these candidates that we think could do really well in a targeted race, in a race that is deeply majority minority district? How can we make sure that our message to those voters is coming from a messenger who they can resonate with? And so I think 2010 was one of the first iterations of this program, and it's evolved ever since then. In 2022, we elected the most women and minority candidates on the Republican side than ever before. I think we had about 800 across the country. So there's a lot of room to grow, but there's definitely a lot of investments in the states to do this. And then once we have a terrific messenger to deliver the same message that we're sending to the rest of our target audience, we're not super highly fragmenting our data anymore. We're going after folks with the right messenger and standing on the same issues that we would deliver to any other voter.
So this program almost symbolizes a professional development accelerator program for such candidates. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I can elaborate on that. And there's so many resources through the program. There's the training component that we do in-house and with some of our partner organizations, like a Targeted Victory, for example, who might come and teach about media buying or persuasion to our candidates. There's also monetary contributions to the campaign. In some cases, there's independent expenditures that are put into place to help these candidates. And the idea is to really grow the bench for the Republican Party so that, 10 years ago, we didn't have a lot of Republicans, non-traditional Republicans in the states. 10 years from now, we'll have even more party leaders who are women, minorities, who served in our military to represent the party at a national level. So that's really the goal.
Yeah, that's impressive. Okay. So, all right, we're going to, Tom and Sam. I mean, I think one of the things that you all have been tasked with in working with minority voters, and Tom, I'm going to start with you, because the complexity of Latinos, Asian Americans, when you look at all the spectrum of countries of origin, there's no one Latino, there's no one Asian American. I mean, I imagine the countries of origin are very, very different when people bring their biases stateside. I would imagine a high degree of complexity beyond language, but synthesizing stories. Take us through what that looks like in terms of synthesizing into let's just call it one band, one sound, to get people to unify in a certain direction versus being very fractured and splintered.
It's a really good question. And I'm really interested to talk actually a little bit about some of our biggest nonpartisan work that we've done in the last cycle. And Fenton was the agency of record both for the LA County Voter Registrar and the New York City Campaign Finance Board with all of their election communications. And obviously, these are the two largest, most diverse municipalities in the country, something like 20 plus languages spoken with language mandates to deliver advertising and media in many of those languages. So we had to be really thoughtful about how we got at this problem. And I think one of the things that came up sort of most urgently at the beginning was when we were doing our research, just how little information actually exists about people's country of origin. You have the American Community Survey, where you can lean on a little bit from the census, but you look at some of the largest media data companies, whether they be Nielsen or YouGov, you just don't have that much information about where people come from and what particular regionalism or dialect they might speak. So it was really important to us that we worked with local buyers and we worked with people who knew the communities really well on the ground, which was a little bit more expensive than it would have been if we had just sort of done everything centrally, but really ended up making a great deal of difference. And the other thing that we really tried to do was, particularly with in-language outreach, is make an investment in audience modeling. And the reason why we did that was the way that we target in-language media right now so often leans on IP targeting. So whatever you are doing to browse the internet, if you have changed your browser language to Spanish or Chinese, that's how we target you with in-language media. Obviously, that's not how most people browse in-language media. Most voters are bilingual, even if they might prefer to receive media one way or the other, or they might just not bother to change the switch. So what we actually did was we deployed some surveys via programmatic ad units, and we asked them, what language do you prefer to receive media in? We aggregated that out, and we created a model that allowed us to deliver language in-language media at like a 300% increase than what we had before. So the intentionality of working with buyers on the ground, and also the investment, and really just asking people what they prefer, what language they prefer to receive media in, really made a great deal of difference for our work.
No, that's great. So Sam, I know one of the things you've talked about in your career is having worked with minority women candidates. Look, there's clearly a stigma one way or another that follows those candidates when they run, based on the perception of, and just the lack of historical representation for people to model what that candidate's going to be like in leadership and office. Can you talk us through some of the things that they had to be coached through, aware through? Even the recruitment of followers, it almost becomes like membership, like what that's going to entail in this sort of America, because I imagine that's a huge piece of not only getting the people behind them, but them in the face that they put out in the marketplace.
Sure. I think from my personal perspective, I think the biggest thing that I experienced while working with minority candidates, women candidates, or minority women candidates is to kind of break the notion in their mind that they have to act or be a certain way. We're in a time in politics where it is very advantageous to be very different right now, especially with the way a lot of the swing seats or swing states kind of like operate in politics. So like, due to population trends from the last 20 years, people moving away from cities to the suburbs or beyond, to different election law changes in states like California, where you're seeing MODERATOR. So like that's an effort to register every single person in the state, and all mail ballot voting systems. What you're kind of seeing is like there are, I think 20, 30 years ago, there were 175 seats in congressional seats in the country that were between D+5 and R+5. As of 2 years ago, I think that number is down to 75. Of the 75, I think in 2024, I think 36, 37 were considered toss-up by different prognosticators. So like what that really means is there are way fewer swing seats or true toss-up seats in the country now. And when we're talking about presidential electoral politics, I mean, we're talking like a handful of states at any given point. So what that really means is like you're seeing the same seats, the same states, always kind of be the focus, the emphasis of where all the money's being spent, because those are the seats that Republicans and Democrats have to win to control the House, to control the Senate, to control whatever it may be. So like, what does that mean? Well, like that's where every 2 years, every 4 years, every 6 years, you will see a ton of money being spent pushing candidates. And so where it becomes very advantageous for a political campaign is to offer up a different type of candidate that we haven't seen before, right? And giving voters a different option. And so what that might look like is, I worked with Congresswoman Young Kim. She was born in South Korea. We talked quite a bit about her American dream story, but it does mean quite a bit. It means a lot, something different to a lot of people in her district when it's coming from her, as opposed to these state legislators that had been there for 20 years, right? And went to the local high school. And so like offering up options, running candidates that look different. I think, I work at Target Victory as a digital fundraising firm. Just the innovation of digital fundraising has really given the opportunity for candidates who didn't come up in the political party systems to kind of catch fire and then really run like these like robust big campaigns. So the example I like to use all the time is Democrat Katie Porter from Orange County, California. She was a law school professor, single mom, and she was actually able to outraise my boss, who I was chief of staff to, I think by $2 million from the primary election to the general election because of digital fundraising. So like having diversity candidates who can tell different stories that are authentic, unique, I think is really important. It's where politics is going. It's what we've seen the last 2, 4, 6 years. And I think I think it's probably one of the most interesting trend lines that we're seeing in politics. So.
Yeah,
And can I just add something real quick? Because you made the point about authenticity. And I think that part of the desire for consumers, voters, target audiences, where that's coming from is the user generated content. As that has more presence in our overall media landscape, folks are going to want more, they're going to want politics to look a little bit more like the videos that they're engaging with in their everyday lives. Want is a strong word because they actively want to avoid engaging with our ads. But they're going to expect that there is this, I'm getting a sense of who you are in a non-scripted way. And I think that the more that there's that desire, the more candidates kind of have to answer that.
No, I like that. One of the things you talked about was interesting candidates, particularly impact in raising and generating funding. And Maddison, you had something very interesting when we were talking about the breakdown of the social construct, that when you look at voting populations and tendencies, some of the things that had underpinned our identity, let's say the church, let's say, because most people work from home, our besties at work, local family, but everybody dispersed. You made the comment, you can't assume that anyone Latino coming to the country is Catholic. They're not carrying religion at the same clip they used to, and thus don't vote a certain way. So how have you all sort of dismantled the reliance on stereotypes that help build voting blocs, or much of the institution of this country, in an unconventional way, but still keep an eye on the pulse? Like, are there different tools you're using, different signals you're turning on? What are you cross-referencing? How are you sort of making it make sense when a lot of this just doesn't make sense anymore?
Sure. I think, and to go back to the example I think I gave before the panel, Republicans of yesteryear, built campaigns kind of based on, first of all, we get outspent a lot. I don't think that's a secret. So we have to be really specific when we're building our audiences. And so for a long time, back in the 90s specifically, in places like Arizona, Texas, we would take for granted the fact that, well, a group of Latino voters, they're probably Catholic, they're probably pro-life. Let's not include them in a lot of our marketing because we don't think we can pull a lot over, but the ones we can pull over, let's shoot them with a lot of pro-life messages. And then that universe would get largely untapped for the rest of the campaign because we didn't feel like we could stand on the issues that we were running on for the bulk of our audience and move voters over. And I think that kind of rule book has been completely thrown out at this point. If we look at RSLC engagement in Arizona, for example, this past year, we were in for, I believe, about 1.5 million. Legislative District 16, and they have nestled districts there. So it's one senator, 2 House members for each legislative district. That is a primarily suburban district. It's Maricopa County with a few outliers. We ran 3 Hispanic candidates and we swept all 3 seats. And so I think it does point to having the right messenger. But then when we looked at the message, it was the same message that we would be giving anywhere else in the state. The same exact ads were being used elsewhere. And those issues were the border, the jobs in the economy, and taxes, specifically taxes on food and rent, which Democrats had recently taken some hits on in the prior session. So those messages ran. We were extremely successful, but the messenger mattered. And then if you look at a district like District 23 in Arizona, that district is part of Maricopa, which is very suburban. That's the more Republican part of the district. It's part of Yuma. It's part of Pima. Pima is where you're going to find a large group of Native American voters who I would consider that the more Democrat stronghold of the district. Yuma was really where the fight was going to be. And that was the district in whole is a majority minority district. It borders Mexico. And that was the one district where we ran Spanish language ads. And we just translated the exact same ads that were running elsewhere into Spanish. And we also had such a great candidate in Michelle Pena. She ran on a lot of agricultural issues. She worked in agriculture. She worked specifically with like migrant workers who were working in ag on employment and payment details. So she was just the right horse, and she delivered the same message about we have to fix the border. You know, in Yuma County, you can't get a hotel room because all the hotels have been converted into space to house migrants. And, you know, the hospitals are all in unsettleable debt. Those were issues that she talked about, whereas her opponent kind of stayed more on the generic talking points, focused on abortion, which really didn't resonate with that voting bloc. So I think the difference is we stopped micro-targeting, and I don't want to use that as a blanket term, but, you know, we stopped taking people out of our universe, assuming that they would never vote for us. Once we realized we needed to deliver our message in a better way, it resonated with way more people than we could have expected.
Well, that's outstanding. So, Niamba, I know that on the other side of the coin, there's the problem. One of the things you talked about was the pandering. So while certain parties talk about, hey, we're not going to pursue them, we don't think they're going to vote, you talked about the late stage coming into the frame, assumption that they will, but the way audiences are pandering is offensive. So in an add subtract formula, what do we need to stop doing, and what do we need to start doing in more literal terms in your mind?
I think Maddison kind of pointed to some of this. So in terms of stop doing it, I think is to stop relying on old assumptions of what your audience looks like because you have an idea of this minority is going to behave in a certain way. Like, I think that, you know, we're human, we have these biases in politics have been a certain way for a certain amount of time. But I think one of the things that we did on the campaign is we tested those assumptions. We added some new information about current trends that weren't just relying on previous cycles, but like as much as we could get of like what was happening on the ground now. And then I think the other thing in terms of adding is to add to your strategy. So I think we've heard a little bit about audiences and whether you're gonna micro-target them, how you're segmenting. But I think the other thing is having a broad enough sense of platforms that you're gonna be on, not assuming that you're gonna find all of your target voters in this one platform just because there's a huge audience of Black voters that watches it. And knowing that minorities are just as diverse in their media consumption habits as other groups. And so we kind of need to build our plans to reflect that more and more.
So Tom, you talked about the idea that you need interesting candidates. I mean, I think the world knows we only want to hear from interesting people. Boring people, you guys are dead. But how does that impact the opportunity of unlocking money and funding? Because a lot of it at the end of the day comes down to that. Who is able to bring in cash flow to merchandise and elevate? Did you guys get to a place where you're literally looking at geoscape, census data, voting blocks, and say, we need a candidate that matches the neighborhood, similar to the way the NYPD needed to have cops to reflect the neighborhoods they were policing? It's not difficult. But did it get to be that literal, either for the two of you, Sam or Tom, when you said, look, these things need to reflect the neighborhoods from which they are not only trying to get support, but need financial resourcing to make this agenda move? Did it get that level of hyper specificity?
So I can kick us off here and just talk about an anecdote here from some of the work that we did with the voter registrar. So out in LA County, we had heard from a number of community groups that Latino voters in particular, there was a gap in trust with vote by mail specifically. And California is unique, particularly LA County, because they've had permanent vote by mail for many years now. This is not a new tactic, but you look at Latino voters around the region, and there is just a big gap historically in the number of folks that voted in person versus voted by mail. So that was a priority for the registrar. And one of the things that we did with them was to try and figure out how are we going to use a messenger that this community is actually going to trust, and who's that going to be? And the person that was actually leading implementation for the department, Monica Flores, bilingual, she grew up in the county. She's done a lot of work to try and be noticed with community groups and do a lot of direct outreach. So we did sort of a multi-pronged campaign with her as the messenger, where we took people to the voting center. We had her walk folks around the voting center, explaining how the vote by mail process works, how the ballots are counted, in language, speaking, with a regionalism that folks in LA would understand. This wasn't someone from outside of the community. And then also we partnered with Univision, and we had a great cross-channel partnership where we had her on the 5 and 6 o'clock news, many times over the course of the final stretches of the campaign. And she was really able to, ask and hear from voters directly. And I think one of the interesting things is that there's sometimes a call-in aspect to some of the shows and the segments, and we actually heard from folks directly about how having Monica there as the messenger really increased their trust and made them want to vote by mail this year. So I know it's a little adjacent to the question, but I thought it was a relevant anecdote.
If you say, I'm going to allow you to double tap on that, but also how do unique candidates create new storylines that just didn't exist before? I think that's another powerful piece that you were starting to touch on.
Yeah, I think to address the first question, again, because of the nature of these swing seats, these circumstances where 90% of Democrat voters are likely to vote for a certain candidate, 90% of Republican voters are likely to vote for a certain candidate, right? Based from a polling perspective, everyone's trying to get the 90+%. It really puts the campaigns in a situation where we're all kind of fighting out for these swing voters. And I think maybe a decade ago, a swing voter to a campaign team might look like, it could be undecided, it could be independent voters. It's become exponentially more complicated than that. And because of that, we're all looking for different data points to find these voters. Who are they? Because we are looking for ticket splitting voters, voters who will vote maybe Republican down ballot, but may vote for Harris, or the inverse of that, right? And so to kind of touch on the geoscaping or we are looking at all of those data points to find any inroads with any of these voters before our opponents do or before the outside groups come in, right? And to kind of touch on what Maddison said about targeting is sometimes what you see is they say, the hell with the targeting. We are just gonna overwhelm every voter. And it's actually a very effective tactic in a lot of these seats, because when there's a ton of money and it's very hard to get the attention of any of these voters, right? Especially in the LA media market. So what we've kind of seen was, as a campaign team to reach these voters, is we are using even voter registration data. I know there's a lot of talk about modeling and what have you, but in a place like California, there is a lot of self-reported data on the voter file that is very inexpensive to get. And the voters are telling you, I want my ballot in this language. And they will, in California, they actually tell you, I was born in this state or this country. So it makes the campaigns, it really lowers the bar for how hard it is to find some of these voters. I can find a voter that was born in Vietnam who actually requested their ballot in Vietnamese. And we know that there's a greater chance that they're a ticket splitter. And so if they're a Democrat, I believe we have a very good chance of getting them to vote Republican. Well, then it turns into a tactic of, well, how do we reach out to them, right? With our personal stories. So it's, a place like Orange County, there are I think 9 Vietnamese language television stations. I think there are 10 Vietnamese language newspapers. There are 5, 6 Vietnamese language radio stations. And the place that I think kind of really blew up in 2024 were YouTube channels and content creators, all commenting on politics, right? And they are all reaching out to both the Republican and the Democratic candidate campaigns, wanting access, wanting interviews, wanting and so there's so many different ways to communicate your message. And once you kind of figure all that stuff out, because that's the easy stuff, it's then what do you actually say to them? But it is it's gotten very complicated. And both sides have gotten a lot better, a lot smarter. We all value those voters more than ever. And there's a willingness to spend more money to reach out to those voters more than ever. Last piece of information here, Congresswoman Michelle Steele, client of mine, narrowly lost, I think, about 600 votes in the most expensive House race in the country. We are talking about over $50 million in a seat that had 315,000 votes. And we were talking about 70,000 Vietnamese voters. So you guys kind of understand, like, there is a greater appreciation for this type of stuff by either side. And like the amounts of money that are being willing to be, I mean, $50 million is what you see in a lot of statewide races, right? And we're talking about a very small congressional seat just outside of Los Angeles. And there was over, I think it's going to end up about around being 52, 53 million all in from all sides. So
I want to build on some of that perspective, and I'm going to come back to Tom on this, and you can tap in. When I hear some of the things you laid out in terms of the geographic backgrounds, I mean, if you look at the exit polls and the electoral map, in particular for you, Tom, it's very clear the picture that's going to remain going forward. Literally speaking, there were small pockets in counties that were blue that will probably be permanently red because people have gone to bigger cities where there's more urbanization and culture, let's call it. So that's the difference. That's like people leaving Watkins Glen, New York, and say, I'm going to orbit around Manhattan. That's very real. What does look, you go through New York, a lot of non-New Yorkers, I hear Indiana accents in New York now. So a lot of Midwestern transplants in an international community. Midwest people are great, by the way. But it's very different than Long Island people. So that means it's a different New York. And we're seeing this across the country. More people immigrating from the continent of Africa into Texas. I think they figured out DC is like too cold. They're smart. So what does that now mean in terms of strategy and going into these backyards, knowing certain areas will be permanently left red? So there's almost nothing you could do. And now there's a different voter mindset because they're coming from regions where it was a very different conversation, whether it was more or less passionate.
Yeah, I was born and raised New Yorker. Working in New York politics is always funny because everything changes so quickly. A neighborhood that was one way a year ago can be completely different a year later. So we have to have sort of much better just data cleanliness also. We look at the voter file much more frequently, really test assumptions more frequently than we do in other places. But I think another really interesting thing, and this came up with Maddison a little bit before the talk, was just looking at New York specifically. Talk about things that were, chess tables that were thrown up in terms of turnout. The changes in turnout this election, changes in vote behavior this election. There were many regions of Queens shifted, much further to the right than they have before. Regions of Brooklyn and the Bronx as well. So, I think it really speaks to the need to sort of constantly be checking your assumptions. And retesting in different neighborhoods, and really listening to people and understanding what folks are telling you, either liminally or subliminally. So we did some really interesting work to try and build relationships with community groups around the city, and to really be talking to voters about what are the things that they really cared about in this election. And because we were nonpartisan, we were able to have a little bit of a more open discussion about it. And I will say that some of these conversations that we did a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking with sort of after the election were very, very clear in the months leading up to it. People were talking about deep frustrations with politics nationally. There were deep frustrations with the administration. So that type of on the ground listening is just so important too. So New York, I think, is a really interesting test case for how all this is showing up.
Yeah, and just to build off of that, I think it's happening across the country, and I want to make sure I say that this isn't happening overnight, and this isn't the first cycle where we've seen, oh wow, this is a great shift. I mean, this has been a trend. If you look at South Texas, I think someone mentioned it on one of the earlier panels, the 20 counties that are the southern border of Texas all shifted to the right this election cycle. But in 2022, Republicans flipped 10 of the 20 from blue to red. And then in 2024, we flipped 8 of the remaining 10. So 18 of the 20 counties voted Republican. And we're talking voted Republican for the first time, but we've been closing that gap cycle to cycle. I believe there are 10 state house districts in the Rio Grande Valley area where 10 years ago we weren't fielding a candidate. And so we didn't win those districts on our first go at it, but on our second and third go at it, we've now hold, I believe, 4 of the 10 or 5 of the 11, however you consider the Rio Grande Valley. And the next 4 are competitive because I believe President Trump's low watermark there was 49%. You have to check my math on that. I mean, even in El Paso, I think the president received around 32% back in 2020, and he hit around 42% in that county now. And that is probably one of the more Democrat parts of Texas you're going to find. So this has been a long-going trend. I think a lot of it, to what you said, it's at the grassroots level. It's taking away all your presumptions about a voting block, getting into the community, finding a good mascot for your brand, and letting that person run with it and build coalitions and give people permission to vote one way that they historically have been told they can't, right? The first time someone breaks with a party, I mean, that's an event in that person's life. And so like being reminded of that and knowing that it takes time to build, I think is important.
No, that's great. So listen, we could go on for another half an hour easy. We do have time for questions. I have one of my own, but I'm going to throw the mic also to Steve to see if there's anyone in the audience wanted to ask a question.
He's not called Popeye for nothing, right?
Thank you.
There he is.
I was just going to ask, with the media environment being so fragmented, what were some of the challenges that you all ran into sort of reaching these novel audiences and the multicultural universes that you were hoping to talk to?
Did you guys hear? Okay.
You know, I can start here. I think one really sort of interesting challenge is just, you know, trying to figure out what placements are actually available in language, and where we could actually target people at the level that we wanted to. And, you know, also trying to figure out and balance that with where do we go broad and deal with a little bit of wasted spend. So, you know, we made a lot of use this year of CTV. Because that really helped us balance the need to be sort of efficient with the targeting, using the new audience models to really understand, okay, we're relatively sure that this person actually speaks, you know, one of 2 languages. And then balancing that with sort of more traditional partnerships with in-language media outlets like Univision and Telemundo and other outlets. We really like working local also. Some local radio stations gave us some really amazing creative packages. So being able to work with some of the smaller outlets, you get access to their talent on air, you get access to you know, a lot more bells and whistles than you would with just sort of buying linearly. So those were all things that really helped us, I think, just tactically get at this audience this year.
Yeah, I can build off of that. Money was our biggest problem, and it usually is. So a couple ways to combat that. I mentioned earlier, we cut a lot of our radio and TV, or radio and CTV ads in that district in Arizona in Spanish. We actually left all of our mail in English. We got to save money, but we got some data from Univision that, you know, kind of suggested that the vast majority, and I'm talking like 90 percentile of our target universe, spoke English outside of the home. So for those reasons, that was an easy choice for us to make. And then just getting creative, to kick it back to 2023, there was a race in Kentucky for Secretary of State, and we wanted to promote Mike Adams, the incumbent, based on his work on the SAFE Act, which was a domestic violence survivors related bill to protect victims. And we were looking for middle-aged to younger women to get this message in front of, and we found them on true crime podcasts that were extremely cheap to buy. So just getting creative and ways that we can reach our audiences.
I think for me, I think having a better understanding of how campaigns were allocating funds to reach voters. And so what I kind of mean by that is, what I saw was, you know, everything in politics, there's more that's changed in politics or campaigns in the last 6 years than probably in the last 20 years or something like that. And a good example of that would be how I saw Democratic candidate campaigns prioritizing OTT and CTV over some of the more traditional mediums. So a good example is, like, I think it was like we were 2 weeks into September, my media buyer calls me and says, hey, hey, Los Angeles broadcast, there's 6 target congressional seats and a ton of other races, and the broadcast price per point was maybe the best it'd been in a general election in a decade. And I was like, okay, what's the deal there? They're like, the Democrats aren't buying right now. They're up big on OTT, they're big on CTV. And, I can't recall a single instance in which where I was a general consultant where my campaign hadn't spent more money than our opponents on CTV or OTV. And so I told them, hey, like, how badly are we getting outspent? And between, I think the candidate campaigns and the outside groups, I think we're being outspent 3 to 1 per week. I think they were in the vicinity of 600, 700,000 per week in a congressional district. And so, and that was all, it was a really interesting thing that once I started looking into it, we were seeing it kind of happening all over the place, right? And so I think that was one of the big obstacles, which is like every cycle, there's something new, there's something different, and constantly just like adjusting and having a better understanding of like, hey, like we need to like move faster to kind of be able to pivot was one of the big challenges this cycle. I think what we saw this cycle was just like kind of like the first step in where you're going to see campaigns like willing to spend quite a bit of money on quite a few different things. I think I saw more Spotify ads this cycle than I can ever recall. But yeah, we all, campaigns are about imitation. So like you will start seeing campaigns being way more open-minded about where they spend money, how they spend money, and the timing of that.
Yeah, so if Sam said money, I guess I can't say that on the other side. But I can definitely say time was a big challenge, and having to do the work of introducing a candidate who was a challenger being perceived as the incumbent, and then doing that in 107 days while everybody's pissed off about pocketbook issues, I think was a big challenge. But some of how we were able to deal with that, especially with our Black voter outreach, is to kind of have the frames about lowering costs and then have the data about what was the way that we were going to get to talk to people about that, and that was going to resonate with them in whatever subgroup that they're in. So if you're looking at elder millennials, for example, you might be talking about lowering the cost of childcare and elder care. If you're talking about lowering costs for younger folks in Gen Z, you might be talking about the cost of rent. And I think that was like a space that we were able to play around with a little bit in this election, because we did have some more resources, but time, definitely.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. This is a conclusion of our Beyond Identity and Politics panel. Please give our panelists a warm appreciation. Thank you.